Does Ukraine have freedom of speech during the war? How are the media surviving under such harsh conditions? How do media perspectives within Ukraine compare to those from outside the country? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media outlet about Ukraine, run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld and the president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today is Ola Myrovych, CEO of the Lviv Media Forum, one of the largest media events in Ukraine. We're recording this conversation during the forum itself in May 2025 in Lviv. Before we start, let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Your support is crucial as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also support our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we provide assistance to both soldiers and civilians. Donations are welcome via PayPal at ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the descriptions of this episode. So let's begin. Ola Myrovych, welcome to this podcast.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Thank you for joining it. So we are talking at the Lviv Media Forum, and you are leading this wonderful forum. Tell me why you continue to do that during the wartime, why you think it is important.
Yeah, to tell why we continue, I would rather start with telling why we launched this event. So the idea of this event was born in 2012 after the European Football Championship, which Lviv was one of the host cities. So the communication team just realized that the fact that so many foreign journalists come to the city helps Ukraine to open itself. So both the city and Ukraine as a country benefit from it. So they thought what could be, what could continue, this tradition. For sure, you cannot organize European football championships every year. So at that time, there was also no forum for journalists in Ukraine. So they combined these two ideas to get together with Ukrainian journalists and bring foreign media professionals. And they launched the first forum in 2013. It was a part, of cultural advocacy, this, mild diplomacy that most Ukrainian initiative didn't think about it at that time. So that's how the forum started. After the full-scale invasion, it was not only our choice, but our obligation to continue this forum, because at this time we need to talk to the world, and the forum is one of the platforms to do this.
And it's always a question like how media are developing during the war, right? Sometimes we hear the questions that, look, but probably your journalists have left the country, probably you're living, of course, we're all living under the risk of missile shelling and drone shelling. At the same time, there is a big question of security, but also there is a big question of like the transparency and openness and readiness for truth and everything like that. How do you perceive it? How do you perceive how journalists in Ukraine started thinking maybe differently about their profession after the full-scale invasion?
Actually, journalists in Ukraine, journalists became very important overnight, because people who found themselves in a situation of war realized that information is as important as bread. That what we were told by people who escaped occupation, that you desperately need information to take right decisions. And that's what journalism actually does. So the role of the journalists became very important, and the war highlighted actually this fact. And I think that also the media community reconsidered it to some extent.
Some people are saying that, look, Ukraine doesn't have a full freedom of speech because we have like the single marathon on the TV, so the combination of broadcasting of different TV channels. Many people in Ukraine criticize it. Others are saying that, look, but the government should have access to its citizens, and it's probably the best way to talk through a combination of efforts of different TV channels. But at the same time, we kind of lack the competition between TV channels that we had during the peacetime. If you want my opinion, I don't have a clear attitude to that. So I see how the single TV marathon like reduces the freedom of speech, but at the same time I understand that during the war it is probably necessary because you have to have the direct and 24/7 access of the government messaging to its citizens, because it's a question of life and death. What is your take on this?
I think that marathon played a huge role in the very first weeks of the full-scale invasion, because people were scrolling their news feeds and watching TV 24/7. However, the situation changed. Also, the consumption preferences changed. Mostly Ukrainians now, as people around the globe, use social media to get access to the information. For sure, at this moment, TV marathon is one of the tools that Ukrainian government uses to promote its work. However, I don't think that it's too influential in the Ukrainian society, because the share of the marathon is not as big as the government could expect. Maybe also because of the quality of the content they produce. So I think that we need maybe to discuss this when also discussing our EU accession efforts, because this marathon isn't useful anymore, and probably the money that are allocated to fund this marathon could be used to support Ukrainian media, for example, after USAID withdrawal.
Yes, just to give an idea to our listeners that of course, American support was important for Ukrainian media sector, but not in the sense that we all depend on this, right? So it was rather important for such things as fact-checking or such things as investigative journalism. But coming back to the question of freedom of speech, because when I'm asked what is about the Ukrainian democracy, you don't have elections, the mandate of President Zelensky has expired. We can't have elections during the war, and that's another topic for security reasons. But I'm always arguing that, look, one of the key elements of democracy, freedom of speech, is existing, and there are lots of criticism of the government. Journalists, there are some cases of bad behavior of the government with regard to journalists, but we cannot say that journalists are persecuted. We cannot say that media is persecuted. We rather can say that independent media, investigative journalists who are very critical of the government, have very high authority and a very high reputation in Ukraine. What is your take on this?
I participated in the UNESCO World Freedom Days lately, and our colleague from the media development sector from Latin America shared with us that USAID withdrawal impacted the the sense of security among journalists, safety, because people are not protected anymore. And at that very moment, I realized that in Ukraine, the situation is completely different, because in Ukraine, journalists are free to work. For sure, there are some particular cases when journalists are persecuted, but these are rather private initiatives of people who are interested in this than the governmental policy. So in Ukraine, we have huge amount of very strong investigative media that are impactful, who publish materials that influence governmental decisions. I think that the role of investigative journalism in Ukraine is still overlooked, you know. As for the freedom of speech issue, for sure the wartime and the martial law imposes some restrictions, which is a very normal case for every country at war. However, not only media, but civil society, broader civil society influences is still influential in terms of shaping the governmental policy. I always highlight this fact, saying that we have a public advisory council at the Ministry of Defense, which is probably a unique thing for every country at war. So I truly believe that, we talk about freedom of speech issues not because we face lack of freedom of speech, but because we fear to have some restrictions. We are very sensitive to it.
At the same time, the question of censorship and self-censorship is different during the war, right? Because, well, we clearly have an idea of more responsibility of journalists to what he or she reports. Is it a sensitive information? Is it a classified information? Can it harm the Ukrainian people? Can it harm the military? Can it harm the strategy of making warfare, of making defense against Russia? And I know that lots of journalists think in these terms. Some of them are making a clear distinction between the military aspects and political aspects. Like in military questions, you impose some self-restrictions. For example, you do not film the places where the rocket came because we know that Russians use double tapping. So they will send another rocket in 20 minutes or 30 minutes to kill the rescue teams. So that's a general understanding. Not everybody follows it, but there is a general understanding that you should not do that, or you should not, of course, film the restructuring of Ukrainian military units on the front line. Or there is an ethical issue, like when there are funerals. Will you film directly the faces of those people who are in the mourning for their dead? Will you film the faces of people who were just killed? There is a big discussion in Ukraine, and I think one of the key points of this discussion is that freedom of speech cannot be infinite. It cannot be limitless. It has some boundaries, ethical boundaries, security boundaries. And I think this is a new reflection compared, for example, to what is happening in America, where people right now are saying, well, freedom of speech is absolute and you can say whatever you want. If it offends somebody, it's their fault. I feel it very disturbing. How you react on this? This like self-restrictions and maybe even self-censorship.
Yeah, journalists like doctors, like medical workers should put the do no harm principle first of all. So in the situation where the society finds itself in a very vulnerable position, journalists have to consider this principle for sure. And, it's both on the social but also very individual level, because journalists combine many identities. They are journalists, they are Ukrainian citizens, they are fathers and mothers of children, so they have sometimes they have to decide, to take very hard decisions. And we also are learning by doing what I observe. Maybe we would decide something else in the very beginning of the big war, but now we start discussions about individual perception, and harmful effects of the photos taking from the location where Russian atrocities took place. And I think that it's also a space for learning, not only for us, but also for foreign journalists. In some sense, we are starting a discussion that should have a spillover effect into the community of journalists, a global community, because now we are facing the war, but unfortunately, we are not the only war region, war zone around the globe. And maybe there are lessons learned that could be taken from our experiences and, introduced to the global community as joint principles that we could rely on.
Yes, I agree with you. And one of these lessons is the question where to put the limits on freedom, which in my mind, I think if we put this question like 10 years ago to our foreign, especially Western liberal partners, they would go crazy because how freedom is limitless. No, freedom is not. I'm saying this as a philosopher. I'm very worried, as I said, about this idea that, we should have a limitless freedom of speech. Because in our case, this is clear that we need to put the limitations to the Russian information influences, right? Again, this was a heretic idea for many people 10 years ago. Now more and more people understand that probably there is something in this, because if somebody uses information not in the peace motivation, not as an instrument of peace or like of exchanging, of transfer knowledge, but as an instrument of war, and Russians are using information to harm. So that's a different story, right?
Yeah, it's especially interesting in terms of the Ukrainian society, because I always call Ukrainian society wild, wild east. These people, like, freedom is in our blood, and sometimes it's, you mentioned limitless freedom. So sometimes we feel freedom as a limitless thing, but it does have boundaries for sure. And now we also learn from our experiences in this regard. I think that another process started. We started as a society considering how important institutions are, because institutions impose boundaries. For sure, we as human beings, as citizens, impose boundaries for ourselves as well, but somehow institutions cement these boundaries. So for us, this is a unique opportunity also to reconsider importance of institutions. It's quite an interesting period for the Ukrainian society and for the journalism as well.
And we have some strong media institutions, right? So we have some institutions of tradition, which have some long period. For example, there recently was 25 years of Ukrainska Pravda, which is one of the most read Ukrainian media. 25 years, people would say, would look compared to some 100-year newspapers or 200-year newspapers. But look, we should also understand that practically nothing that existed during Soviet time exists now in terms of media, right? We cannot, I can't, maybe radio, but again, it transformed itself. But if you take, online didn't exist, but if you take newspapers, magazines, nothing exists. So it's really these ruptures which are important. Let me ask you about social media. You already mentioned this. It's interesting how social media consumption is different from country to another, right? So in the Western world, in the American world, Twitter was very important. Now we see that Twitter is really becomes very toxic in some topics. So people migrate to other social media. But if you talk to people from South Africa or people from Asia, India, Philippines, people use WhatsApp a lot. WhatsApp as a tool of exchange information. Ukrainians don't use WhatsApp that much. Instead, we are using Facebook and Telegram. I think these are two major social media in which politically important process is going on. Or maybe I'm wrong. Tell me.
Actually, I think that your observation is very right, and I always use it to highlight to our Western allies, Western partners, the fact that Russia used to influence the Ukrainian informational sector for decades, not only starting from 2014 when the war started, but long before it. We in Ukraine have never had popular social channels, same as in the global world. First, we had Одноклассники, a Russian social network, then Vkontakte, the same one. We had Viber, now we have Telegram. All these platforms were created or influenced by the Russian government or Russian institutions, businesses. It means that it was a policy towards Ukraine, and it was there were huge investments made to keep us as a part of the Russian informational space. So it's not only about the war on the ground. This war has been prepared in the informational space first of all, and unfortunately now we have to consider very hard choices, whether we should ban Telegram on the governmental level. Would it be, for example, would it be harmful for the freedom of speech? In my opinion, for sure, we have to balance national security and national interest with the freedom of speech principle, which means that Telegram, but also other social media, AI, will be under our the government should pay much interest to these channels because it shapes the social opinion, and we can lose democracy preserving freedom of speech.
Yeah, the situation with Telegram is particularly interesting because it is connected with the Russians. We don't know exactly. They're denying that they're connected with the government, but we have mistrust to the idea that anything coming from Russia or having Russian origin can have independence from the government. But the problem is that many Ukrainians use it, right? And it is used in the army as exchange platform. It is used by the government as well. So I think for the government, for Zelensky administration, Telegram is one of those tools to communicate with society. So there is Single Marathon, there is Telegram, there is Zelensky as a personality who addresses the nation every day. And therefore, we kind of in a double situation when we try to use it, but at the same time, it's a very dangerous tool because it's a tool of our enemy.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you ban Telegram, there are ideas that I've heard from several people that if you ban Telegram, then the Russians will just use the money they pour into Telegram into something else. For example, in TikTok, and there will be lots of video influences, and probably the video influences, the influences with this short video will be even more dangerous. What is your take on this?
I think they already do. They put resources in different baskets. For sure, Telegram is maybe the most visible, but still they invest in YouTube, for example. So many YouTube channels, Facebook accounts are working to influence our informational space. And it's not only about Ukraine, it's about Africa. I've heard from many colleagues of mine that they do have Russian sources of information and they are free of charge, which means that we are not alone in this. And we have to consider it as a systemic problem, not, as a specific Ukrainian case that also Ukrainian government is in charge of. Especially in terms of freedom of speech, I think that we have to consider the new platforms that are very easily accessible for the governments as a potential threat, which means we should use it, but do it wisely and maybe put also some legal obligations on the creators, on the developers to be known. Because when the problem is that we don't know who is managing Telegram. We cannot identify the person. If I tell something from my name, from like as an individual, you can consider whether to trust me or not. But if you are told something by a person who you don't know and you cannot influence, you cannot ask questions, this is the problem. So maybe transparency caused by illegal obligations would be important in this regard. I truly believe that we have to join our efforts with our global allies and think how we can systematically respond to this question.
Yeah, I think it's one of the key problems, this anonymity, right? So anonymity is present everywhere on social networks, on internet, but the very idea of Telegram is based upon anonymity. So you will probably have 90% of all accounts which are anonymous, which are called in very, fairy tale-like name, like Joker or the Insider or whatever else. And the problem is that it's like going, if you want to buy food, right? You go to the supermarket and you basically choose by brand. You understand, okay, this is the brand. If I get sick after I got this sausage by this brand, so I know who is responsible for that, right? If you go to a marketplace, you meet a peasant and you say, okay, where does your tomato come from? And she says, well, I grew it on my own. And you kind of decide whether you trust it or not. But now Telegram is like you're going to a square where there is lots of food, but you don't know where it comes from. There are no brands, there are no customers, there are no people who sell it to you, so you just take it.
And it's freedom without responsibility, which is a problem itself.
And our information space is increasingly anonymous. I don't mean Ukrainian. The global information space is increasingly anonymous because we don't know where does information come from. Right, we cannot track it, and I think it's one of the biggest problems right now.
Yeah. Where in my opinion, where freedom and responsibility are split, there is always a problem. By the way, that's what we see during elections, because we vote for a president, but then when we, for example, are not supporting his or her policy, we just start arguing. But we made this choice. And we have to take responsibility. This what also makes democracy weak, because it's the vote is always personal, but the responsibility is not. And for sure, it impacts, our ability to resist threats. Because and it's always about when you are personal in this story, you always behave very carefully. When you are just one of a million, you try to avoid this responsibility, and that what we see now, and that what also makes our situation much harder, because choices of the society are not always in line with our individual choice.
Let me come back to your forum, to Lviv Media Forum. You host a lot of discussions, and there are many foreign guests. And I assume that most of these guests are kind of sympathetic to Ukraine or interested to Ukraine, but still, you cannot have the full agreement. So there are lots of points of disagreement. This is my hypothesis, because I also talk with a lot of people from all over the world, from Europe, from America, from Africa, from Asia. Of course, we have always disagreements, and that's good. That's very good. What are the key points of these disagreements? What you notice from forum to forum? Like, what are Ukrainians are struggling to persuade or to argue to the different foreign colleagues?
Yeah, there are several. First of all, it's about the role of journalism in supporting institutions, because journalists are they have to observe the work of the institutions and be like gatekeepers. However, when you are at war, you have to consider also to be very careful in it. So in these terms, we wanted also to discuss during this forum whether journalists can do their work but not harm institutions, very weak institutions that we have in Ukraine. Second is investigative journalism and its impact on the state. Because to some extent we realize that we talk about corruption more intensely than our Western partners do about their corruption, and it might seem that corruption in Ukraine is it's everywhere. However, based on the last research, we see that around 80% of people haven't experienced corruption in their life, which means that maybe we journalists don't do our work properly, or maybe overlook something. Corruption for sure is a problem for Ukraine, but it's a problem everywhere. In my opinion, in Ukraine, there is a problem that Ukrainian media focus on very bright cases of corruption rather than talking about it as a social phenomenon. And it's also a responsibility of journalists. So it's interesting that during this forum, a foreign guest, Ilana Bet-El, would provide this perspective. That they representing Solo partners, they conducted a research and found out that the grand narrative around Ukraine abroad is that it's a failed state without institutions. And
which is total bullshit.
Absolutely. And they came, the foreign experts came to Ukraine, and they saw on their own eyes that it's a bullshit, as you told. And but Ukrainians sometimes are convinced in it.
I will explain to our audience why I use such a harsh word, because empirically, if Ukraine was a failed state, we could not resist Russian invasion for 10 years, for more than 10 years, because it's not civil society only that defends Ukraine. Of course, there are lots of people from society who went to the army. It was lots of individual choices, but you cannot defend against a nuclear power and second, I don't know, strongest army of the world, or first strongest, we don't know, or 10th, whatever, if you don't have strong institutions. And that means that this story about the failed state is overestimated. At the same time, of course, Ukraine has huge problems of this, all this kind of a framework of institutions which is still very old, and therefore it produces lots of these incentives of corruption, and it exists. I still don't think that we overcome it, and we will face huge challenges in the coming years, whether it's years of war or peace. But I also think that what is corruption, right? People just use this word without reflecting. Is it just taking bribes? Is it proposing bribes? Corruption, in my opinion, is when you forget about public interest and you think about your private interest. Is that when you encroach with your private interest into the public interest? And then we ask a question about the Western democracies. What's happening there? What's happening when politicians only think about the next election? When politicians only think in terms of political marketing? Is it not a different form of corruption? Because they are thinking of themselves. They are not thinking about the public interest. So it's a very interesting philosophical question.
Yeah, it's a trap of democracy. And it's interesting that a foreign journalist brought this perspective to the forum. They said, look, you are all talking about corruption, but maybe you overestimate it, and you just don't realize how it impacts the global perception of Ukraine. Guys, you have to change something in your investigative reporting.
Well, that's a very, very interesting point, and I would like you to reflect upon it. I think that investigative journalism is quite strong in Ukraine, and it's quite visible. And maybe investigative journalists, there are a few of them, very well known. They're very popular. They are very widely read. But aren't we in this trap that basically, we show how institutions work badly, not in a good shape, while we have the public institutions already, the whole infrastructure of anti-corruption institutions, while what we lack is this banal phrase, the solution journalism or whatever. Can journalists be constructive force? The critical force is very important. When journalists criticize the institutions, it's very important. But can journalists be a force that helps the government to develop strategies? Because they can. Because they have access to people. Journalists have the most grassroots access. They know where the problem is, right? And they can help the government to identify these problems, probably.
Yeah, continuity of reporting after the case was revealed is very important. It's crucial, but it doesn't draw as much attention as the news about a corruption case. So many media focus on this because they truly need to engage their audiences. They are hunting for traffic. However, the good solution will be to follow up on the cases and also to ask questions that society can reflect on. I remember one of the most famous corruption cases in Ukraine was pictured in social media with a photo of a man lying on a bed with millions of US dollars in bills. But I haven't read in any media outlet the question how many people brought this money to this official. So, it's also about perspective for sure. It's very important to investigate, to reveal the corruption cases, but also giving a broader picture to the society, to push the society into the reflection mode. Why this corruption is the case for Ukraine, and on the other hand, we. In Ukraine, we are over-focused on ourselves. If we were interested in a broader world, we will also find out that corruption is a reality for many countries that we consider as countries of wealth. So I think that what lacks in this situation is to give yourself a helicopter view, not only focusing on particular cases, because that's what media do. So from the professionalism perspective, they do fantastic job. And I believe that Ukrainian investigative journalists are those who can teach and share the experiences among their peers in different countries. However, what we need is to change the perspective how we report on these cases.
Maybe my last question: what lessons other countries, other media environments, other journalists from other countries can get from Ukraine?
I think that resilience requires planning, not improvisation. Those who were better prepared, they made it easier to switch to a war mode. So they had some strategy, or at least a plan how they would face the war situation. I also think that Ukrainian journalists could they couldn't think of themselves as resilient as they appeared to be, and also from these technical things, Ukrainian public broadcaster conducted work even after shelling of TV towers. So even technical specialists could be the source of very important information, experiences for their colleagues abroad. I think that we now are maybe focused on survival and fighting the aggression back. But when we have more space to consider, to think about our experiences, we will be more ready and open to share them.
Thank you very much, Olha, for this conversation.
Thank you, Volodymyr.
This was a podcast explained in Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, the chief editor of UkraineWorld and the president of PAN Ukraine. My guest today was Ola Myrovych, CEO of the Lviv Media Forum, one of the largest media events in Ukraine. We were recording this conversation during the forum itself in May 2025 in Lviv. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We rely heavily on crowdfunding, and therefore your support is crucial for us. You can also support our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we provide assistance to both soldiers and civilians. Donations are welcome via PayPal at ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You will find these links in the description of this episode. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.